and Chris is coming if he's not on already. He's here. Okay. I'm Elaine Hill, co-chair of the Fort Lowell Historic Zone Advisory Board, and let's just introduce ourselves to Damien. Go ahead, Chris.
Chris Yak, I'm a co-chair with Elaine of the Fort Lowell Historic Zone Advisory Board.
David.
Hi, Damien. Dave Peets. I'm not sure what my status is, honestly.
Okay, and Carol?
Hi, Damien. It's Carol Maywood, and I'm like in my third year post, running out of time.
And Mike Bell couldn't come tonight. He has a family in town, and Mary Lou can't come tonight because she's out of the country. So this is just a single agenda item for tonight, and it's a presentation of a concept plan that Damien's working on concerning a zoning overlay for part of Fort Lowell neighborhood, including the historic zone. And I'll just go ahead and let him do a presentation. Any questions before we start?
Yeah, I got one. Damien, if you can go over kind of, I'm sure you'll talk about it, but what the objectives are and what you're looking to get out of the board today, if you're looking to get anything from the board.
Yeah, so I think the presentation sort of covers all of that, and it's going to sort of walk through. The presentation is going to really walk through sort of a little bit of historic context about the uses of the neighborhood, really look at different models around the country, and sort of talk about sort of what I see as sort of an ongoing sort of issues that have occurred with the neighborhood, the sort of a highlights of some of the investments that have happened, look at some models, and then look at where we could go.
So it's, I just want to make sure I understand. So strictly right now for informational purposes.
No, this would be ideally at the end. I think you guys could take an action to support this, but I think hopefully there'll be robust conversation about this, and then you can either take action at this meeting, or you could, theoretically you could table it. But I would love if you guys are supportive of this. And I'll sort of talk about where we are in a process. And if you were supportive of continuing the exploration of this, that's really what we're talking about. This isn't a definitive policy. This is a path towards creating a policy or exploring it. And I'll talk about some of the funding mechanisms and why this juncture really makes, there's opportunity, I think, at this juncture.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Any other questions before we? Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and then okay, can everybody see that? Okay, so by way of background, I know most of you. I'm Damien Klinko. I still serve as the executive director of the Tucson Historic Preservation Foundation. I've served in a variety of different public offices, and I was born and raised in Fort Lowell, and my family has property in Fort Lowell. My mom still lives in Fort Lowell. My father lived in Fort Lowell until about the middle of last year when he passed away. As I've been thinking, not just this year, but for the last few years, there's really sort of, Fort Lowell is sort of at a crossroads. And I want to talk a little bit about why I think that's occurred, and some of the themes of what's happened and why this sort of has occurred. So this is really about how do we revive heritage and culture in Fort Lowell. So, in order to really talk about that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Fort Lowell, and nothing I'm sure you guys don't know, but I have some really wonderful photographs. Of course, Fort Lowell, goes back many, many hundreds of years to the Hohokam, who had a village locus in this area. In the 1870s, the U.S. military established a military installation at Fort Lowell, which was where the name comes from. This is the post hospital in Fort Lowell. It was a major military installation serving all of the different bases as sort of a supply center during the Indian Wars. The buildings were built out of adobe. They were sort of vernacular in their material tradition, but they were squarely in the territorial phase of design. So they had these sort of New England characteristics, but built out of this regional local material. I love this photo. You can even see the windmill in the back. But of course, it was a military installation. The fort within 15 to 20 years was abandoned because the U.S. no longer needed this level of military installations along in the Arizona territory, and everything was auctioned off that had any value. The doors, the wood, anything that had value was auctioned off, and it created this acceleration of deterioration of these buildings. And so suddenly these buildings went from having a use to being these sort of romantic ruins out in the desert. And people started to visit them, and they really became a very early tourist destination. When people came to Tucson, it was like you'd go and see San Javier del Bac mission, and you'd come and see the ruins of Fort Lowell. This is an early photograph, probably from 1906, that shows somebody visiting the ruins of Fort Lowell. You can see in the middle, there's someone in a horse and buggy. This is the commissary looking north with the Catalina foothills in the back, and you can see there is no buildings beyond. But it really was this sort of this idea, this romantic idea of creating a sort of a place that people could visit. And there was very early on a movement to start to save the ruins. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. In 1929, the University of Arizona, in partnership with the city, launched an effort, and really led by the Chamber of Commerce, to save the ruins of Fort Lowell. So after the fort had been decommissioned, not only had all of the physical value been auctioned off, but the land in quarter sections was auctioned off through land patents. And the parts that were on the east side of Craycroft, which had the bulk of the ruins of Fort Lowell, there was this real effort to raise money for the city to buy those ruins and create a regional park and restore them. I think it's really interesting sort of to note, and looking at how the development occurred. Once that land sale had occurred, this area, because of the environmental conditions of the area, it was very, very, very rich soil because of the confluence of the Pantano and the Santa Cruz River. So farming was very, very successful here. And those large tracts of land quickly became farms, and Mexican-American and Chinese-American families started moving to the ruins and really served creating a community, sort of an agricultural community. And there was a need for supplies and resources, and so little stores started to develop. And La Tiendita is a remnant of that, which is still in the Fort Lowell neighborhood. So that was a neighborhood shop that sold goods. By 1912, there was an effort to get telephone service out to Fort Lowell. And shortly after, by 1915, a real effort by the residents of Fort Lowell to get mail service, because until that point, it really was an isolate in the Tucson Valley. Farmers began utilizing the buildings in different ways. This probably is farmer Cole is probably to the left, who owned that tract at the time. This is the commissary from the rear. If you're familiar with that property, there's a root cellar, and this building sat on top of the root cellar. And they were growing chilies and melons and strawberries and all sorts of different cash crops. And this is chilies drying on the back of that building, probably again 1910. Around this time, because there was so much interest and tourists coming to Fort Lowell, the Arizona Daily Star published a booklet that you could purchase to go out and visit Fort Lowell that provided historic context. And this is a cover of that booklet, as people needed something to do when they went to Old Fort Lowell. I mean, it was 7 miles from Tucson. It was a day's journey. It really took an effort to get there originally by horse and then by car. It was pretty dusty. By the 1930s, the University of Arizona, in partnership with Pima County and the National Park Service, started creating a master plan for what they envisioned as a state park to really rebuild some of the buildings at Fort Lowell. And this is an illustration from that CCC WPA project. In the 1930s, the Bolsius family also discovered Fort Lowell. They were Charles Bolsius was an artist who had studied at the Royal Academy of The Hague in the Netherlands. And his brother was a traveling salesman and had sort of settled with his wife in Albuquerque. And Charles had moved in the late 20s and early 30s to Albuquerque and Santa Fe. And he really began sort of following in the footsteps of the WPA wood carving tradition. So he was painting these incredible paintings, and he was starting to carve furniture and wood in New Mexico. And they moved to Tucson, and he went on a drawing trip out to the ruins of Old Fort Lowell and found the post-trader store available, and infused into this really a high Pueblo revival style. It's one of, I think, the best examples of Pueblo revival architecture in the American Southwest, certainly in Arizona, and has this real beautiful Dutch tradition. But what they really did was create a nexus for artists in the 1930s and 40s who started to build an arts colony in Old Fort Lowell. So artists like Germaine and Renee Cheroui, who had worked for Rodin, and Giorgio Bololi, who was an industrial designer and artist who went on to do went from Santa Fe also, who went on to do amazing projects in Mexico. Charles Baudet, Ruth Brown were just some of the names of these important mid-20th century artists, early 20th and mid-20th century artists. And it really is about authentic stories and identity. But one of the things about Fort Lowell is the buildings have always been private because of the way that land use developed in Fort Lowell. It's just residential zoning. And so many of the properties have these incredible interiors, some of the best Pueblo revival and vernacular Arizona sort of artistic interiors in the state. And yet they are not publicly accessible. And this is a picture of the post-trader store from the rear that just sort of gives a glimpse of sort of the intrigue and sort of glamorous interiors that are just behind the sort of very austere adobe walls from the street. There's also been a 45, almost 50-year tradition in the neighborhood of cultivating a stronger sense of place. So the neighborhood has always been at the forefront of protecting and celebrating and enhancing the unique cultural identity of Fort Lowell. Ben and Peggy Sackheim and Roz and Ed Spicer were really integral in the creation of the historic district, of creating a historic preservation zone. Ben and Peggy Sackheim had worked to save Grand Central Terminal in New York, and they brought that ethic with them and really helped foster not just a historic preservation zone, but then the purchase of the San Pedro Chapel as a neighborhood and community center, raising the money to do that, took the full neighborhood, and that generation of neighbors worked very hard to make sure that the rural identity of this place was intact, so that as you drove through Tucson and as it continued to expand, Fort Lowell had a real unique sense of identity. To that end, the city of Tucson and Pima County, through a variety of acquisitions and partnerships, began the Fort Lowell Master Plan, which was funded by county bonds, which was finalized in September 2009. So it's really hard to believe that that's almost 15 years ago, and that plan still has not been completed. But that initial funding, Elaine, that represented about $4 to $5 million of initial investment, which was the acquisition of the Atkins property, the restoration of Officers Quarters 3, and a lot of site remediation and archaeology. It also included the purchase of the commissary. Here's a picture of those completed restoration of the first phase of the restoration. I think it's worth noting that because these buildings haven't been utilized, they haven't been actively occupied, they are really prone to continued deterioration. And it's really become sort of an epidemic in the neighborhood, not just in these buildings, but certainly the commissary, and now starting to be others as the sort of old guard of the neighborhood has changed. So this is part of the kitchen. This is part of the kitchen construction ruins. This treatment was developed by David Ubeda, who oversaw Tumacacori National Historic Park. This wall has collapsed in the last 2 years, and it sits in a ruin. So, we're investing millions of dollars of taxpayer funds, and yet because of inactivity, the buildings continue to deteriorate, and almost the restorations are beginning to need restoration. So to that end, a massive investment into the park was included in the bond, this recent City of Tucson bond project, which included restoration of the commissary, restoration of the Donaldson House, and then a lot of the phase 2 work. So there's been a lot of stakeholder meetings with a host of different community-wide stakeholders around how that money will be prioritized. And the county is signed an agreement now with the city to oversee that project. So all of this money is being invested, but then what? Are we building a park that's just sort of a museum to itself that people may or may not utilize? Or could we do something that's more expansive and use this moment to really create something that could enhance and improve and enliven the neighborhood, not just now, but for the next generation? So as I noted earlier, a lot of the old guard who were integral in creating the historic district and saving the San Pedro Chapel and building the strong sense of place, neighbors who lived within the HPZ or just adjacent to it have died or they've moved away. And so there's been this real changing of the guard, and there's also been a consolidation of real estate. And so there's less owners. The commissary, which at one time had anywhere between 5 and 10 residents, now has none and hasn't for a decade. The Atkins property used to have people living in those buildings. Now there's no one. So there's been a real stagnation, and although it's been towards saving the buildings, it's been at a cultural cost to the neighborhood. So the idea is a Fort Lowell Arts and Culture Overlay Zone. So what would that be? So the idea is a carefully crafted overlay that would allow potential new permitted uses, restrictions, and incentives. It would be designed with the intention of creating opportunities for community engagement, promoting cultural uses, arts, complementary businesses, and celebrating our shared past. Currently, with the existing zoning, it would be very difficult. For example, the Post Trader store, when it was for sale in these two recent turns, the Tucson Museum of Art took a look, and they were very concerned about the land use and their ability to actually actively utilize the buildings without going through a rezoning. And in the last turn, the Alexander Calder Foundation flew out and took a look at it, and again had the same concerns. The current zoning would not allow these types of uses. And so this is an idea that would really, again, plan for the future of how some of these buildings could maybe become complementary to the rest of the neighborhood. So in order to really begin to assess what's working in other places, I looked at 4 different models: Barrio Viejo in Tucson, Old Town Artisans in El Presidio. I looked at Mesilla, New Mexico, and I looked at Santa Fe in New Mexico. And so rather than talking about the ins and outs of how these policies work, because each of these places have different types of zoning, it has very different zoning regulations. The way that the zoning happened over time is very different than Fort Lowell. So instead, I'm going to talk about where these places are and what's happening and my own experience in them. So the first is Barrio Viejo in downtown Tucson. So Barrio Viejo was purchased primarily by about 30 of the buildings were purchased by a single family in the 1970s who was concerned about their deterioration. The patriarch of that family passed away a few years ago. And with his passing, his children have really taken on a much more strategic and maybe like a curated approach to how they wanted to see these buildings redevelop. So the underlying zoning allows for more commercial uses within this neighborhood. It was principally all residential. Now you have a series of new businesses. The Exo Coffee is a coffee shop by day and a boutique mezcal tasting bar by night. I go there a couple times a week, and it really is a place where community now comes together. Like I think I'm more connected to my neighbors. So I live in Santa Rita Park, south of Barrio Viejo. And there's now more community because of these small businesses than there ever has been before, because now residents are actually going to places and they're interacting with each other in this really organic way. It's sustainable, it's walkable, and it's really enriched the vitality of this neighborhood. When you go here in the morning, like it's a host of different neighbors from all over Barrio Viejo and Armory Park who are sitting having coffee, and it's really an amazing place to connect. The Nightjar and the Meyer Street Market are 2 examples of adaptive reuse. The Nightjar is a cocktail lounge that's only open at night. but uses an interior courtyard, and the Coronet is a daytime breakfast and coffee shop. And then there's also the Coronet restaurant, which uses the same courtyard in the back and has a full restaurant menu. Old Town Artisans has been around for at least 40 years, maybe longer. It's a full block within the El Presidio Historic District. It's full of small craft artisans and galleries, and in the courtyard is almost live music every night. There's a bar and restaurant, actually two restaurants sometimes. And it's really had a very, very strong integration with the neighborhood over the last few years. And during COVID, the El Rapido taco shop was purchased and is now an outdoor fresh pasta takeaway cafe. And in fact, that segment of the road has been closed and is really prioritizing pedestrian traffic, but it's really become an amenity to the neighborhood. And if you talk to the neighbors in El Presidio, it's something that's really enhanced the quality of their neighborhood. I also looked at Mesilla, which is in New Mexico. Mesilla is a small agricultural farming village, a rural sort of agricultural village that's outside of Las Cruces. Las Cruces is a town of about 100,000 people. And Mesilla is very similar in some ways to Fort Lowell. And the difference is it actually has a small plaza and one row of storefronts that face it, but the rest are residential ranching and farming properties that are adobe from the same period that most of the buildings in Fort Lowell were built. Today, it's really become this invigorated blend of wine shops and chocolatiers and different types of coffee shops and little stores and residences. And if you go there, it has, again, this really rich history and heritage, but also a strong walkability while maintaining this very, very strong sense of neighborhood and rural identity. It has its own city that is separate from neighboring and really encroaching Las Cruces, but because of that, it's been able to retain that very, very strong sort of rural sensibility. And finally, Santa Fe, which has this arts and sort of culture overlay in a number of places, which allows for residences and these types of stores and uses to coexist in a much more dynamic setting. So looking at the Santa Fe model, which is really sort of an excellent model, and I'm trying to move this little squares out of the way for me. These are the sort of the uses when you compare what New Mexico, sort of the New Mexico structure, and particularly Santa Fe, and the uses that are allowable under their model, and the Tucson Land Use Code. I worked with Tim Kenny, who is a land use attorney who lives in the Fort Lowell neighborhood and has been doing work for the Fort Lowell Neighborhood Association recently, settling the issue between the San Pedro Chapel and the neighboring property and the purchase, and now some preservation strategies around that. But these are some additional permitted uses that we were thinking: artisan residence, craft work. These are actually two uses. It exists already an overlay in Fort Lowell that allowed for artisan residences, but only on the south side of Fort Lowell in the historic district. And I don't think it's ever been utilized because it doesn't have any incentives attached to it. It's just allows for this little bit of use. It doesn't address some of the other issues that need addressing, which we'll talk about. Other uses, cultural uses, and I want to note that we have this little S, and I'll talk about that in a second. Educational uses, instructional uses, alcohol beverage service excluding large bars, alcohol beverage services excluding large bars, but with a microbrewery as an accessory unit, commercial recreation, entertainment excluding large dance halls, food services excluding soup kitchens, food services with alcohol beverages, food services with microbrewery as the accessory services, medical services outpatient. I'm not sure that should be included. Excuse me. Go back. Medical services, personal services. Again, I have question marks next to some of these. These were, again, a comparison to Santa Fe, but they've been included because they really provide a parallel. Food and beverage sales, excluding retail establishment, general merchandise sales, excluding large retail establishment, farmers market, perishable goods manufacturing, accessory use, artist studio, and civic assembly. The S is really to create a zoning examiner special exemption procedure. So this would be a new procedure that would really allow community participation. It wouldn't necessarily establish a new use, but allow an applicant to come in and apply for one of these uses. And based on that applicant and the support of the surrounding neighbors or neighborhood or HPZ, they would be granted the special exemption. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what the benefits could be and what some of the incentives to get people to think about this a little bit differently. And then I'm going to talk about a map, 2 maps actually. So again, this is conceptual at this point. None of this has been developed. So this is really a conceptual framework of what's a path that could be taken, restricting certain uses to certain zones or certain parcels, development standards, which could be incentive or acceptable to all, no more than 4,000 square feet of gross floor area may be dedicated to the non-residential use, but it could be broken down by parcel or by section. The post-trader store is a really good example. I mean, there are houses in Fort Lowell that are 900 square feet, and there are houses that are 6,500 square feet. So there's a lot of difference in what those uses could be. Restricted hours of operation is something that could be developed as part of this. Amplified outdoor sound could be prohibited. Shared parking. Parking is going to be the major thing. If a rezoning were to occur with, let's say, the post-trader store, on-site parking would be part of the development package. There would have to be some sort of on-site parking. But instead of that, we could develop a shared parking model that would allow parking across the zone, particularly for uses west of Craycroft could take place at the park. On the east, it could be on the west, or that would be on the east. On the west, it could be on the Atkins parcel or at the San Pedro Chapel. New uses still need to comply with on-site handicap parking requirements, and 7.5 applies to some, the exemption based on the maintenance of the historic structure. So what are the other types of restrictions? Well, as you'll see in the map, this extends a little bit beyond the HPZ. And so if people who wanted to take advantage of this outside of the HPZ, and I'm going to talk about a few parcels that I think this would really provide important planning for, they would have to comply with the HPZ standards to get the benefits. New constructions, alterations, or additions to any structure with contributing historic or neither, or all new construction should reflect the architectural style and be compatible with the historic contributing properties, excluding any non-historic contributing properties located in the property's development zone. If there's no historic contributing properties in the development zone, the applicable development zone is the entire overlay. So there's 2 different maps. This is map 1. So this includes sort of what the sort of current thinking is for what this zone could look like. It includes most of the HPZ, but it also includes some properties along Beverly. And it includes this I think is really key, the corner of Glen and Craycroft. So this is this is where the Baptist church is located, with those 2-story sort of 1960s apartment buildings along Craycroft. Eventually, this parcel will probably be sold. That Baptist church will either grow outside of that, their spatial needs, or retract beyond their spatial needs. And when that happens, this will be sold. And so how is this property going to be developed? Will it become a Quick Trip? Will it become a McDonald's? Or can we, through a tool like this, help drive a better type of development that would really enhance the quality of this neighborhood and the identity of this neighborhood, by creating especially the parking incentives that could offset that could really be used as an incentive for a better stylistic use of space and design. It also includes this section. Second map includes a slightly larger section, which I think really needs to be explored too. These are the properties across from the Gregory School. As we've seen, there's been very, very high density development to the north of the Rito River. These are old farm and agricultural sites. And through an overlay like this, we could really try to prioritize restoration of those agricultural uses and farm to table restaurants. And there may even be opportunities with the Gregory School. So again, thinking about how this type of overlay could be carefully crafted into different sections to incentivize different things. There's a really beautiful example of a redevelopment outside of Albuquerque. It was an old John Namin property that's now been, which is very similar to this, which was on a large sort of originally historic agricultural site. And it's now become a farm to table restaurant with a small boutique hotel. But they really maintain the volumes and the characteristics and the qualities that make that area really special. And they celebrate the heritage. It's called Las Peplanos, if you want to take a look at that online. So, again, I think Fort Lowell's sort of at a crossroads. Like, if we do nothing, Fort Lowell will eventually just be subsumed into the rest of the city. We'll see these large parcels be redeveloped into much, much higher intensity uses. The rural characteristic of the neighborhood will slowly be eroded. There has been this change of guard, and there's this loss of vibrant residential culture. That's not going to be replaced. Something will happen with the commissary, and there will be some sort of master programming. This is an opportunity, rather than just dealing with a single site, to really deal with the whole area comprehensively and create a model that could really be replicated, I think, in other parts of the city as well. So that's the overarching concept. The next steps would be to formally adopt support for the exploration of this concept. So I think the neighborhood itself and the Historic District Board could request that the ward office direct the inclusion of the Fort Lowell Arts and Cultural District concept into the Fort Lowell bond project scope of work. I think there's still opportunity to do that. Money is going to be spent on land use planning for the commissary, so why not expand it, since the money is going to be spent anyway, to deal with something more comprehensive and really create an opportunity for stakeholder engagement and get everybody into the same room and talk about what could something look like. Because either we're going to do nothing and change will happen to us, or we can create a path that could really result in something that's vibrant. And finally, direct the Fort Lowell Land Use Committee, or request that the Fort Land Use Committee or appoint someone to that committee from here to serve as a point of contact. And finally, this is a great photograph I love from 1910 of people visiting Fort Lowell, because tourists have been coming here for over 100 years to experience the history and culture. That's not going to stop. And so can we create something that's vibrant? And now I'm available for questions and feedback and general thoughts. Since none of you have your cameras on, I can't see your facial expressions if you're smiling or grimacing. So I'd love to have a conversation.
Well, I'll start with a
I'm
question.
going to turn a line up.
I'll start with a question. Do you know, in general, I think most of the zoning is residential. Do you know if the zoning for the corner of Glen and Craycroft is residential, or with
I would have to look, but I suspect it's probably R1 or R2.
Residential with a church.
With a
correct?
church, yeah.
Which is kind of a special use. And then I'm pretty sure that the rest of it is all residential, even up through the on the east side, where the on east side of Craycroft. I think that's all still residential and kind of unzoned at this point. Still holds the old SR zone. So can you talk a little bit about what you think about either specific parcels or selected parcels? I mean, have you thought about named parcels, or can anybody do it?
Well, I think the opportunity through the special examiner concept, and again, this is something that has to be flushed out. Like, just because we continue to explore it doesn't mean it's going to happen. I think that's an important aspect of today's conversation. This is not a vote where, like, after this goes to mayor and council and suddenly it's approved. I mean, there's still many, many steps that would have to occur for something like this to happen, and it would take an action of the mayor and council ultimately to create an overlay. I think the opportunity for community participation and input and the ability of neighbors to veto a concept is really important, and that you're not establishing a new use through the overlay. So, like, when I say establish a new use, it's sort of like the idea of a bar. So somebody comes in and they say, oh, I want to open this, wine. I want to open this boutique wine tasting facility in the commissary. Great. The commissary is kind of an odd example because it's city owned. So there's a little bit more oversight, but let's just, for the sake of this thought experiment, So they want to open a wine bar, or let's say they want to do it at the, the La Tiendita. They want to open a wine bar. The idea is that we wouldn't be establishing a new use. So somebody couldn't, so that with that, when that closed, somebody couldn't just move in and say, oh, you've established now a bar and restaurant use. I'm going to now open a bar with loud music and I'm going to do what I want. It's a tailored application process where each applicant, and there's a precedent for this in the land use code with the artist residence overlay. So there really is a model where there's opportunity for community participation and dialogue and discussion. It also allows, through incentive, in some ways, sort of an expansion of the HPZ to those properties that are to the north and the south of the historic district. So by creating the incentives, those properties would now have to follow the HPZ standards and come before this board when making changes to those properties. So you're actually providing more of a buffer and more physical protection to the neighborhood, because it really is a very, very small HPZ through these types of incentives. So I think part of it is sort of a, and it's not me who's going to create this. I think it would probably be a planning firm like Poster Frost Murto, who's already doing work and has a long record of doing these types of projects in the city, to really get community input and then craft something that really works for the neighborhood. I would say the other big difference is all of the overlays that have happened to date, with maybe the exception of the Broadway overlay, they are proposed by developers who are trying to get something. They're trying to get an entitlement. They want to build a taller building. They want to have more uses. They want to on their particular property. And so they've created overlays to try to get something out of the entitlement sphere. This is really different because it's preservation based. So it's not about tearing down or adding on to buildings. It's really about utilizing buildings in a different way and allowing vibrancy in a different way to occur. And it's not something that will happen overnight. It's something that will take, and Barrio Viejo is a really good example. There was the opportunity to do that for 50 years and it didn't happen. It's only now that there is this sort of new generation of millennials and Gen Zs who really, really are committed to finding places and living in places that have walkability and that have the corner cafe and shops and things that are vibrant so people can walk to them and live with them, as opposed to getting in your car and driving. And I would point out that the neighborhood has stopped being a place that people are coming to. It's a place that people pass through. Fort Lowell has just become a road that is just a cut through between Swan and Great. People do not, unless you're living there, you're not taking Fort Lowell to look at the charming buildings and stop. You're just moving as quickly as you can through the city. So by creating these types of destination concepts, you're really creating community value because people value what they know. And right now they don't know Fort Lowell, and I don't think they really care, the bulk of the city. So by creating sort of a new cultural epicenter, it could really become something truly vibrant. And with the additional investments from the Parks Bond, there's going to be opportunities for people to come, but will it just stagnate? And in 50 more years, we're spending another $10 million of public funds to restore. We're already restoring reconstructions of restorations because we're not actively using them, and because we don't invest into maintenance of them. So how do we do something different that is proving to work in other places?
So, Elaine, could I maybe jump in? I don't know if you had a follow-up to that.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Damien. I guess a couple of thoughts, and I guess the first one is, so your idea of the overlay then is indeed compatible then with the plans that were, that the bond issue was premised on. Is that right?
Absolutely. So the idea is just how do you take all of, what we know is that today things that are museums to themselves are failing. House museums are failing all over the country. The National Trust for Historic Preservation has created an entire initiative to try to figure out how to help little house museums, because people, millennials, this new generation, they're not interested in going to a Victorian house or an Adobe building. and learning about it and then coming back again. It's like a one-time visit and then that's it. If you can create meaningful engagement through use where people return over and over and over again, it becomes part of the fabric of a place. So how do you create something that's really symbiotic and compatible with having these cultural uses? So that's one. Number two, the Project for Public Places, which is a nonprofit planning group out of New York. They've done a lot. They did work on Broadway, but they've also did work with Bryant Park. I mean, they worked all over the world. And they have this idea of the power of 10. And for a place to really work, when you have to have 10 different things for people to, 10 different places for people to go inside of a zone. And inside of those 10 places, there has to be 10 things to do. And it's this power of 10. And if you don't have that, you have this stagnation. They've looked all over the world, and it's that thoughtful, strategic approach that really works in creating vibrancy. So in the park could have many of those. So the museum and the El Presidio Museum taking over the Fort Lowell Museum and programming it, that's a great thing that people will do, and they will get people there. But will people stay, or will they come once and never come back again? Will it be a place that tourists come to visit, or is it a place that people just sort of forget about? And and when their leadership changes, it stagnates again. Or can we create something that's has more longevity and more vitality?
Yeah, I suspect you're right that without repurposing many of these buildings, that there won't be the impulse, for whatever reason it is, generational or what have you. We do seem to be in a kind of era where that in the absence of a kind of commercial or repurpose to them, they are likely not to be maintained. I guess the other thought that I had is, I know, as you know, you've brought up examples of this already, but I guess I'm still sort of wondering about, or trying to imagine what the kind of mixed commercial / retail. I'm not quite sure exactly what the appropriate term is, and residential uses. And so, my lack of imagination is probably conditioned by my reality here in this space where we live, where I could pretty easily imagine, say, on the one side of us, sort of that lovely rear lot of the Trading Post used as some kind of entertainment venue, whether it be an attachment to a wine bar, or you had mentioned music and that sort of thing. And then on the other side, right here, without getting too personal here, but another space here that could very well be repurposed into a kind of commercial enterprise, if you will. And I guess I'm just wondering, I'm trying to imagine, so this space that we're in, what would that feel like? Would it change the kind of character of the space that we really love here? And so again, I'm really thinking about it from our own kind of perspective, but just trying to kind of imagine the kind of mixed dual purpose or multi-purpose kind of neighborhood that Fort Lowell has the potential to become.
So one of the things that I think is really one of the opportunities is through a process, we could really explore that even parcel by parcel. So, and creating an application process that gives the neighbors, gives the neighborhood a veto ability to say, no, this really isn't a compatible use. What you're proposing isn't compatible. So, I think again of the Post-Trader store. The fact that the Tucson Museum of Art has said, and again, their leadership has changed since all of that happened. Jeremy, who was the director, is gone, but they were really looking for a East Side location to potentially move their Western art collection. Mm-hmm. So this was their Maynard Dixon's, their incredible Western art, to really move it and decentralize it from downtown and try to bring their educational services and their mission to other parts of the city that aren't going downtown for whatever reason. And so they saw that the Post-Trader store is something that could really fit that model. what would that look like in the long term? I don't know. Like, what would the restrictions be? Is it, would they want to generate revenue from having, cocktail hours in their gardens? I don't have the answer, because I think those are the details and the nuance that really have to be flushed out through an exploration process. The Calder Foundation, what were they looking at? Were they going to move, $200 million of Alexander Calder mobiles to the Post Trader store and have a West Coast museum? I don't know. I didn't talk to them. I don't know what their vision would be, but the fact that that was somebody looking at one of these properties, galleries, I think, are a really viable location. I know Mark Sublet for a long time wanted to move his gallery into an Adobe building, either in Fort Lowell or, elsewhere in the city that just didn't have the zoning and didn't want to go through that. So again, how do you tailor, and how do we create something that's not just about bars and restaurants, but really about cultural uses that could really enhance? And again, I think the one of the real assets of this neighborhood are the interiors of these buildings that no one ever gets to see. So it's like the city has this cultural heritage treasure that nobody gets to ever know about. And to me, that's a real sad loss, that when people walk into those buildings, they are really moved by those spaces and the power of those spaces. And it makes them preservationists, and makes them care about our city and care about history and care about culture and care about maintaining those values, not just in Fort Lowell, but all over the city. And yet we don't have it, because we have gone down a path that's been very, very restrictive in terms of land use and adaptive reuse for these types of places. And other cities have been much more liberal. But what I think is important about this is I've really sort of approached it in a way that was like, how do we empower the neighborhood to be able to help inform the decision framework so that what goes in is really compatible? And again, it's up to the individual sort of entrepreneur who, comes along to one of these buildings and says, oh, I have this idea. I can't imagine what people will do. I don't know. And, but I know that now it is certainly stagnated. And it's really, I think about when I grew up in the Fort Lowell neighborhood and just how different it is. I mean, just on this one section of Fort Lowell where my parents have their property, there used to be 15 people, 20 people lived. But just like through that, there was the Atkins property and all the commissary buildings. It was just a very vibrant, much more alive place with music, and there were artists living there. And it was just a very different reality than a lot of buildings that have been vacant for almost a decade. And something is going to happen with the commissary. Like, something will happen. Will it be a museum to itself? Will it be public use spaces? Will it be a coffee shop? Will it be gallery spaces? Something is going to happen there. Do we
And the
use
Donald.
and the Donald
That's part of the bond.
across the street? So that will happen no matter what. So that is baked into those plans. And maybe something commercial will happen in the Atkins house. I don't know. So those uses and how those are going to be programmed have not been determined. And that's, again, doing historic preservation projects all over the state without a use. It's not viable. We have to find uses that start to enliven and live these places, or else they're just going to continue to collapse and fail. And we're going to continue to just be restorations.
Hey, Damien, will you go back to the maps?
Sure.
For a minute?
Yeah, absolutely.
Other comments? Carol, do you have any comments, or Chris, about the general concept?
This is Carol. I really appreciate the idea of looking in a forward-looking. It's clear that so many of these buildings have deteriorated since they've been abandoned and no longer occupied, which is heartbreaking. But I think at the same time, we also need a limit to what we're going to invite and allow and request. Will the church turn into a mini Walmart? Or, I think we need good, strong leadership and direction if this occurs, so that we don't overstep what we're hoping to do, and keep it within the concept of respect for the history and the current artisanship that exists in this area.
Thank you.
And Damien, thank you for putting this all together. I really appreciate it. I've been to, I mean, obviously I buy all my coffee at EXO, right? I know what it looks like inside. I know the vibe inside the place. It's absolutely fantastic. I've been to Messia, right? And it's super cool in the square that they have and all the shops and everything like that. Fort Lowell is certainly an untapped resource, I think, in that regard. The it's I think you're right. It is a real shame that people don't get to see inside the commissary and go in the back of the building as well, right? So no, I completely agree. But the one thing I am concerned about, right, is the density. And I don't know necessarily how to frame what I'm thinking about, but the density and traffic, cars, things like that. It is this rural place, right? And in keeping that rural feel and that rural vibe is important. So but the models that you have picked, I think certainly are applicable. And I have enjoyed them when I've been there. So thank you.
Well, and I mean, just in response, I would say that the rural quality is deteriorating. I mean, the rural sensibility that existed 15 years ago has been significantly diminished. I mean, you can't do anything about Craycroft and the 40,000 cars a day that are traveling at 50 miles an hour through the neighborhood. You can't do anything about, without some really thoughtful planning about the traffic on Fort Lowell and the cut through. And I think it sort of has become, I talked to so many people who are visiting Tucson. I was at the book fair this week. People don't know that Fort Lowell even exists. Like, they just don't. It's just a little tiny neighborhood that's just like a dot that, like, at one time had a strong sense of place. It was really like a separate community. And because of development, because of the density that, I mean, when you look at this map, I mean, this area is not that dense. This is like the most least dense part. And I think that's something, because we're talking about creating the incentive tools around the HPZ, we could put restrictions to say you can't change the footprint of the building. You can't take the benefit of this and build another building on your property. I mean, we can put guardrails and protections, but it's whether or not we want to go down the path to explore this as a viable option. Because I think that's the crux of the question. Is it worth continuing and formally looking at an alternative? Or do we just stick with the status quo and hope for the best?
Oh, I want to
completely agree with you. So,
sorry. I just wanted to make a comment about the rest of the neighborhood, because, the rest of the neighborhood at this point is, for the most part, accumulation of subdivisions, starting, on the east side with Orchard River, and then San Miguel, which is part of it is in the historic zone, Hill Farm, Presidio, Adobe del Bosque. They're all inward facing neighborhoods. There's none of them that really open to the Fort Lowell Historic District so much. So the impact for residents is primarily in the historic zone itself. And I think that what David's trying to save has the most impact to the residents of the historic zone. I think the other people who live in those subdivisions would be thrilled. They'd be happy to be able to walk 3 blocks to a coffee shop, a wine bar, a museum, a park. I mean, that's what people really love about the neighborhood in general. So I think that the concept of trying to save what everybody loves about Fort Lowell and yet actually make it more useful and more viable is really good. I mean, I think the concept is really good. I think it's really challenging because you're just exploring this concept alone. It's going to have to be done even with the Donaldson property and the Donaldson's property, the commissary, the Adkins parcel. The park itself is going under the historic part of the park is going under Pima County control as far as their historic resource. So there's so many players, right, that have to be brought in to understand the concept. So what are you thinking? I mean, are you thinking that this is something they'll start to undertake with the commissary and Donaldson?
Yeah, I think
Planning?
that well, so one, I mean, and Jody, I mean, she could certainly tell you from her experience, creating overlays like this are not inexpensive. So if the neighborhood was to fund something like this, you'd probably be looking at 30, 40, 50, $60,000 to create an overlay of this type, changing the lane, because you may have to change the area plan, you have to go through the rezoning process, the community participation. It is not an inexpensive endeavor. This is the moment, if this is ever going, if anything is going to change, or there's going to be a strategic and thoughtful approach to what then we're going to leave for the next generation. And again, this is not something where we do, and tomorrow, like every single house in Fort Lowell is suddenly like a coffee shop. I don't think that that's realistic. I think what you'll see is like, maybe in 5 years, something will sell and somebody will be like, oh, look, I can use this. I can do a coffee shop. I can do a wine bar. It's not going to happen overnight. It's something that is going to take a generation of iteration to begin to transform. But if we don't do it now, the opportunity, I don't think it's going to present itself again. This is the moment because of what's happening with the park and the master plan and the county bonds. And I think that it's an easy sell, because what it's also doing is saying this is leveraging the work that's happening in the park to make sure that it becomes actually the thing that everybody imagined. I mean, I think 15 years ago when the master plan was being created, the idea was like, oh, we're going to invest $5 million and it's going to suddenly become an attraction. And people are going to come from all over the region to visit Old Fort Lowell and learn about the history. I think that what we know today is that that's may not actually happen. So unless when I say you, I say the royal you, all of us, unless we take in some sort of strategic approach to help enhance that and complement it, sure, it'll be like, a little park asset and people will stop in and they'll learn about the history of Fort Lowell and they'll go on their merry way. And that's it. And so we'll have spent all of this money to what end? How do we create something? And I think if when, as the commissary and the Atkins parcel and the park gets redeveloped, I think people will say, oh, wow, this is so amazing. Why isn't it happening next door? Why isn't the Post Trader store? Why, and I mean, the Post Trader store, it's a really good example. I mean, I think that, let's just have a frank conversation. The people who bought it now seem really sympathetic, but they're already the second owners in a year. The first group couldn't even take on the challenge of restoring and maintaining that property. And I'm hopeful that these new buyers will, but they may not. So, they have plans and they have a vision, and, whether that comes to fruition, I'm really hopeful that the building will get stabilized and it will get the significant investment that it needs. But, things for people change all the time. And so that house may be on the market in 5 years again. So, I mean, there's just this sort of churning now that's occurring where you had real strong stability and ownership that people bought into Fort Lowell and they just never moved. And that is now you have a lot more churning of ownership because it's no longer, because that sense of place, that sense of community that attracted people to it has dissipated for whatever reason. And I don't know I can't explain exactly what it is. It could be generational. It could be because of the erosion of the rural character. It could be because of the vacancies. It could be because of all of these things, but it has happened. And so, this is really the moment to sort of be, I think, proactive and forward thinking and at least explore this type of idea. But it takes being bold.
Sorry. Any other questions or comments or?
I guess I do. I think this is absolutely fantastic, but I struggle with projects like this because they seem nebulous, right? What's the next step? What would be, does that make any sense, Damien?
Yeah. So the next step would be one for the board to formally adopt or support the concept framework.
And you go right to the next step slides, which I missed.
So really the first is to adopt support for the exploration of the concept. And again, it's not adopting or saying, let's do this. It's say, let's explore this. And then really it's number 2, which is request that the ward office direct the inclusion of this idea into the Fort Lowell bond scope of work.
Isn't that the county at this point?
I mean, this really, I mean, frankly, this should have happened a year ago. It didn't. And so, you know, I think the first thing to do is to talk to the ward office. The money is coming out of Parks Bond, and I think they could certainly make the request. I mean, it could also be, I mean, there's just a whole host of different places funding like this could come from. So I think the first thing is to just get the request in, and then let's sit. And then I think appointing somebody from your committee to really serve as a point person moving forward, I think would be really key. And then make sure that information is coming back to the board. First, is one, do we support it? Two, can we get the funding to do it? And then three, is there a pathway to really do it and have a dialogue and find something that really works for everybody or not? Because if it doesn't work for the stakeholders, it's not going to move forward. It's just this is sort of how these work. You know, if there's opposition from the neighborhood, if this has to come from this community to say this is something that we want to explore.
And Damien, aside from a kind of straw vote that you're looking for this evening, does the Fort Lowell Historical Zoning Advisory Board have a more formal role at some point?
You know, so in the overlay, I mean, I think as the overlay concept was sort of being fleshed out, the idea one is that if we were to include these expanded areas and they were to take advantage of they would have to follow the HPZ standards. So these new properties that are not part of the HPZ would start coming to the HPZ board for review, and you would hold them to the standards because they would be getting the benefits of the overlay. So yes, you definitely would have a long-term role in the management. And I think there's other opportunities for this board to weigh in on what these uses, approved applications could be. And again, that's all things that really could be fleshed out. I don't have just the actual answer, but I think having a stakeholder who is assigned from your board to serve sort of on the planning team for this, or like, let's just call it a working group. So if you said, yeah, we want to continue to explore this, let's, you know, ask Elaine to do it, or ask David to do it, or ask Chris to do it, whoever is going to, you know, whoever could be the point person. If you could sort of choose that person, you could say, yeah, you know, we're going to ask that person to then come back and report back to the board. I think that's the path. That's the path forward. Because, you know, I think my other worry is that, you know, we could spend 6 months talking about whether or not we want to continue to talk about it. So I'm curious, I mean, could we take a straw poll to just see, like, if would people support exploring the concept?
Maybe we should talk about them one at a time. So I'm not sure what Jody, advise me on the procedural question here. Is there actually an action to take here?
It's your prerogative if you want to take an action. Like Damien said, this is just exploratory. There's a lot of process that this has to go through before it gets approved. This is just a baby step forward. If it gets approved, it has to still get initiated by mayor and council. It would have to go to the advisory board. It would have to have a neighborhood meeting. It'd have to go to the advisory board. It'd have to go to PRS. It'd have to go to the zoning examiner, you know, and then it would go back to mayor and council for review and approval. So, I mean, you're looking at, there would be design guidelines that you would have to deal with and put together. I mean, it would be not a short process. So
that's why it has the $50,000 price tag.
Yeah. And so, I mean, you can, I think Damien's just looking for your support to take it to the ward office to say, hey, we have some interest, you know, can we get bond funding? And, you know, whether or not bond funding happens, who knows whether that'll happen. You know, money would potentially come from other sources, like he said. So it's your prerogative if you want to take a vote on it or not. If you want to think about it and have it on another agenda, you could do that too. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Does anyone make a motion to formally adopt support for the exploration of the concept?
Yeah, I will. I'll I'd like to move for the Fort Lowell Historic Zone Advisory Board to formally adopt the concept as presented today.
So I'll second that. Do we want to modify it to include the items, the other items about, or even modify the language of that request to the ward office?
I would suggest rather than saying we adopt the concept, that we adopt or we support exploration of this concept.
Yeah, yeah, actually.
Okay, I can modify it. So, yeah, I'd like to move that we as it says here, number one, I move that we formally adopt support for the exploration of this concept.
And can I ask a question? I know you're in discussion. Could you appoint a point person to sort of?
Hold on just a second. Does the seconder agree to that modified motion?
Yes.
Thank you. Go ahead, Damien.
Oh, so I guess, the other two components that I think would be really useful is one, this board formally requesting that the ward office direct the inclusion, sort of per item number 2. And then number 3, that forget that, but really just appoint somebody from your board to sort of serve as the point person who can just come back and you can put it as a standing item and that person could report regularly on sort of how this is moving forward. And then you really have a seat at the table in the development process. And I think that's really useful because I can't come back to every single meeting you have to give updates, but if somebody from your board is willing to participate at that level, that would be really awesome. If that makes sense. I mean, Jody, do you think that's a...
Well, I've been on the steering committee for the bond project, for the design concepts in the bond project, I guess is what it is. And lightly updating the board on that, mostly because there hasn't been anything happening for a long time. So I'll volunteer to do that, continue that. The other modification on the aspect of number 2 is I think that needs to be clarified about what that step is.
Okay. I think
whether it is the ward office or whether it is the county, I just don't think it's clear about what the approach is to try to get into the scope of the bond.
So I think through the adoption of formal support for the exploration of this concept, could you at least say that you would request the proper, through that person, the proper, through your appointee, that person would, because I mean, again, we can come back, I guess, once we sort of start to figure that out. But really the next step is we have to go to the ward office and we have to give them this presentation and we have to say, hey, there's support for this and we really want to see funding move forward in some way. So it's ultimately in the city of Tucson. It's going to require the action of mayor and council. I've had some preliminary conversations with them. They're, I think, open to the idea. They were like, what does everybody think? I was like, well, let me go find out. So,
yeah. And I think I'd be happy to be the point person. I'll be happy to meet with them, with you.
Okay.
To discuss this and to find out the appropriate next steps, maybe. Just to not overstep somebody else, you know what I mean? If there are other activities already in play with the programming of the commissary and the Atkins part, or the commissary and the Dawson House, then we kind of need to understand. We need to know where we're going before we go.
That sounds good.
So Chris, you want to modify your motion again?
Yeah. so let me make sure I got it right. So we're modifying the motion to formally adopt the exploration of the concept with Elaine as the representative from the Fort Lowell Historic Zone Advisory Board. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay. So, all right, I'll do it for real this time. All right. So, so yeah, I'd like to move that we formally adopt the support for the exploration of the concept as presented today with Elaine Hill as the appointee from the Fort Lowell Historic Zone Advisory Board.
And to explore the next steps is what
Okay.
I'd add.
Yeah, and to explore the next steps.
And I'll second. And so let's vote. And David, according to the City of Tucson, you're a member now. So you can vote. Would you like to vote?
No. Has he taken his oath of office yet? If he hasn't taken his oath of office, he can't actually vote yet. Sorry, David.
Okay. Sorry, Dave.
You're close. You're so close.
I've come this far.
Don't give up. Okay, Chris, would you like to vote?
Yay, I vote in support. Yes.
And Carol?
Yeah, the current status is not taking us anywhere, only leading to deterioration. I think we have to do something, and this is the first hopeful approach that's been brought to us. So I vote yay. And could we email Dave a copy of the oath so he can take it right now and vote?
I think I have to take it in front of the officer of the city. Is that not correct, Jody?
Yeah, the city clerk's office. I am not good enough for that. Sorry.
Sorry.
And Mary Lou did it by Zoom, I think. So they'll even do it by Zoom.
Yeah, and I thought I did mine at the local UPS store.
UPS.
They'll even go to UPS. They just won't go to Jody. So I voted yes. So I think that motion passed.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate it.
No, thank
Well,
you
I
for
think
taking
it's a
the
brilliant-
thank you for taking the time to put all this together and to present to us. This is a
Yeah.
pretty cool concept. Barrio Viejo is fantastic. Mesilla was really cool. Yeah, if we can a flavor of this with the Fort Lowell style, I think is absolutely incredible. So thank you.
Anything else from anyone? Well, thank you for attending a special meeting, an extra meeting this month, and we may have another one, who knows? And that was the agenda for tonight, so thanks for attending.
Thanks. Good.
And I'll adjourn the meeting.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Are we